Okay, this reading for this week is Takahashi Gen'ichiro's Sa yo Nara, Christopher Robin. Goodbye, Christopher Robin, published in 2009. Okay, so this is a very recent work. This too is a perennial favorite among students, so you will enjoy this work. And there's a lot to think about in it. It's a deceivingly simple, it's on the surface a simple story, but it's actually fairly deep and philosophical, so there's a lot to consider as we read this story. Okay, Takahashi Gen'ichirō is a major contemporary writer of fiction and essayist, born in 1951 in Hiroshima, graduated from Yokohama National University, became involved in the student movement in the late 1960s, worked as a construction worker for about 10 years, during which time he suffered from a kind of aphasia, right? So he forgot how to use language. And in order to recover and rehabilitate, he tried his hand at fiction. So he tried writing fiction in order to regain his ability with language. In 1981, he published his debut work, Sa yo Nara, Gyangu Tachi, Goodbye, Gangsters, right? Sa yo Nara, Gangsters, I think there's a translation of it by Michael Emmerich, I think. Received an honorable mention for his... Received various awards. Okay, you can read the rest of this introduction by yourself. This story we're reading today is included in his collection of stories, Sa yo Nara, Christopher Robin, okay, which won the Takahashi Gen'ichirō Prize in 2012. And David Boyd has translated this work into English, and it appears in Monkey Business, I think. Okay, into the story now. We jump into the study questions. We have 9 study questions. Actually 12, including the further ones, further study questions. Okay, so let's jump right into it. Study questions. Number 1. Identify the narrator or narrators. It's somewhat ambiguous, and there might be several, or 2 rather, narrators in the story. Okay, so keep this in mind as you read it. Does the narrator, the I, person who's calling himself I, in the story change at some point, or is it the same narrator throughout? Okay, identify the narrator or narrators and describe them. Number 2, identify and describe each fictional character that appears in the work. So the old fisherman, the wolf, the young girl, and the story he or she is generally associated with. Okay, so these are famous characters from previous works of literature or popular culture or Disney animations and whatnot. And then summarize what happens to that character. Okay, is what happens to that character consistent with the usual story, or does the story here diverge at some point? Number 3, what is the rumor referred to on page 2? Okay, so this is ambiguous, but something has happened, right? And this is one of the main, one of the crux questions of this work. Something has happened that has caused everything in their world to go bonkers, to go wonky, right? What has happened? What is the rumor here? The rumor is that what? Number 4. Summarize the episodes involving the astronomer, the physicist, the music lover, the neuroscientist, the head nurse, etc. How do their stories relate to the main story in the world of the characters and its events and themes? Okay? So one question that is very important you need to keep in mind is, are these 2 worlds separate worlds? Is the world of the scientist and the astronomer and the music lover and the other humans, the head nurse and so forth, is that in the same world? Do these people exist in the same world that the characters live in? Or are there 2 separate, autonomous, independent worlds that exist within this work, within this story? Okay. So depending on how you answer that question, you will interpret the story in a different way. Explain the various ways in which the universe is shrinking, disappearing, and the reasons for its shrinking. Okay, again, in the world of the humans, right? They're noticing that the number of stars is diminishing, for example, that matter is suddenly shrinking. How does this story of material, physical shrinking of the universe and the cosmos of the human world relate to what is happening in the world of the characters? Okay, and that's basically question number 5, an extension of that. What are the 2 worlds in this story? Are there 2 worlds in the first place? When I wrote the study guide, I assumed that there are 2 worlds, but it might be the case that there's only one. Okay, keep that in mind as you answer these questions. How are these 2 worlds, if there are 2 worlds? related, connected, causally? How does what happens in one affect what happens in the other? Number 6. 6 is the question of the nothingness, right, that appears in this story. What causes this nothingness that is slowly and increasingly encroaching upon their world? Okay, what can stop it? They think of all kinds of measures to stop it, and what is effective, what is ineffective. Number 7, what is the event that occurs in the other world, or the world of the humans, presumably, that is referred to only as it on pages 6 and 7 of the translation? Okay, something has happened in that world, it, and we don't know exactly what it is, but there's several testimonies of what happened that are all inconsistent with one another. What do you think this event was? Okay, so a lot of students have written their last essays about the story, and we have a wild variance of interpretations about what this it is. One person suggested that it is the last human shutting a book. One student wrote a paper that argued it is the sound that is made, the event that takes place, referred to as it, is the last human writing a book. In other words, humans stop reading books. Not writing a book, reading a book. Humans stop reading books, and as a result of humans moving away from stories and language and reading books, the characters of those books suddenly began to disappear, is what she argued. How does this event, whatever it is, affect the characters of this world, of the main story? Summarize the testimonies of those who experienced and witnessed this event. Number 8 is a simple, straightforward question. How do the characters resolve to combat the encroaching nothingness? Okay, what do Winnie the Pooh and the others do in order to stay alive? Okay, and this relates to the existentialism, which I discuss in a bit on number 12. Number 9, what is the one last story that Pooh writes? Might it be the story we are reading? Okay, keep in mind it's the very last story that he writes right before he decides to die and disappear. It might be the story that we're reading. It might not be, though. It's just a thought that sort of sprang to mind at one point as I was reading the story. Okay, number 10. Okay, further discussion questions. These are the ones that sort of require you to think a little bit more deeply about the story and its sort of philosophical ideas and message. Is the story an allegory? Okay, so I've discussed in a previous video what an allegory is. An allegory is a kind of story in which all the major events, all the major characters stand for something else as symbols, right? If the story is an allegory, what represents what? For example, the nothingness that is slowly encroaching on the characters equals X. The shrinking physical world equals Y. And so forth, okay? Number 11 is another question that makes you sort of think deeply and generally about the meaning of the story. Is our world today, that is the social and symbolic order that we inhabit, shrinking, right? Were things fuller and more meaningful in the past, and now with modernity and with the contemporary world, is this world of meaning shrinking and diminishing and weakening and disappearing? In other words, is the importance of symbols, metaphors, narratives, stories, and so forth diminishing in the modern and contemporary world? If so, what are the likely consequences of this? Okay, so keep this in mind as you think about what Takahashi Gen'ichirō was trying to say by writing this story. Is he making a comment about modernity and so forth? Number 12, how does this world challenge the typical worldview of the existentialists? And I actually had drinks with Takahashi Gen'ichirō a few years ago, and I told him that I was teaching this work in one of my classes, and that it seemed to me that this work is a critique of the main philosophical paradigm that dominated not only Japan but the world in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, and that's the philosophical paradigm of existentialism, right? So can this work be read as a critique of existentialism? And obviously to answer this, you will need to look into existentialism a bit. But to define it very, very briefly, existentialism is basically the idea that we no longer inherit this world of meaning and this world of stories and whatnot to inhabit with modernity, right? Those disappear. So in the place of these old existing stories, humans have to create their own story individually, on an individual level, and everybody makes their own story and makes their own meaning and makes their own worldview, right? Which is sort of what the characters do in the story, right? To exist the next day, they have to write their own story. But this begins to fall apart at the end, right? Because they don't have a shared story to inhabit, they each make their own story, and this leads to all kinds of problems, right? And eventually, this sort of existentialist way of living doesn't pan out, doesn't last very long, and they eventually disappear in the end, okay? So consider whether this story can be read as a critique of existentialism. Okay, that was a pretty terrible definition of existentialism, so you'll want to look into that a bit on your own. Okay, so at the end of the study guide, I have a list of the literary terms and cultural references that appear, including Urashima Taro, who appears at the beginning of the story. And I have a short definition of allegory. So review allegory in Japanese, gui, guwa, allegory, gui, guwa. Okay? Alright, that concludes my commentary on study guide for Takahashi Gen'ichiro's Sa yo Nara, Christopher Robin, published in 2009. If you have any questions about this work or the study guide, send me an email. Bye-bye.